Are then recording. I'm here with Eric Kaufman. How are you doing today, Eric?
Doing pretty well, Jonkel. It's morning here in London. Doesn't look too awful out there, so that's good.
Excellent. Yeah, I was actually surprised. I had a friend in London in the summer, and it seems like you were getting a bit of a heat wave at certain points, and a lot of the apartments don't actually have air conditioning, surprisingly enough. Which, as an American, that's like a sacrilegious thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, very few have it. Very few. You just if it gets very hot, you just get a fan very close to your bed, but it doesn't get very hot very often, actually, certainly not by American standards. It's very rarely does it break into what you might consider over 90 degrees. That's very rare.
Right. Um, you're the author of a book, and I'm kind of in the Zoomer illiteracy trend where people have just stopped reading books because they're too busy reading tweets. But I've been vaguely aware of the premise, and it has, I think, it sort of planted a seed in my brain since I believe you published it in 2018. And since then, I think I've been trying to kind of work that out and understand the implications. Can you, for someone who's not familiar with White Shift and your thesis, can you kind of briefly explain that to people out there?
Yeah, that was my last book, White Shift, which is really about the rise of national populism. The first, well, the most recent wave basically has two main arguments. The first, the 1.0 argument, is the reason for the rise of national populism has to do with significant ethnic shifts in Western countries, and the signature issue is immigration. So that's the issue that symbolizes this ethnic shift and this change. And so that's really the issue that voters are moving to the populist right on. And the reason that you have a space for populist right entrepreneurs is because the mainstream right has been unable to articulate what a significant chunk of the electorate wants due to the role of the Overton window, or we might call kind of limits or taboos on the bounds of permissible discourse. And so the political correctness or woke question is actually implicated in the rise of populism. The second part of the book is really just looking longer term and talking about trends around assimilation and how I sort of was arguing, I think, that the mainstream, so white ethnic majorities in Western countries will kind of become more beige, to use Michael Lynn's term, through intermarriage, but will essentially retain their collective memories, myths, and symbols and remain majorities. It's just they'll be mixed race, and that will be kind of the new dispensation. But that's kind of looking 100 years into the future based on intermarriage trends and identification trends.
Well, it's interesting that you push that out to 100 years because I've been following the demographic trends and trying to keep updated on that. And a lot of people for the American context would say that the most quick growing demographic is Hispanics, but in some senses, in absolute numbers, the numbers coming in legally, illegally, whatever, that might be true. But in terms of actual growth per year, I think the category is other, which I don't know anyone. If I said, hey, how do you identify? Oh, I identify as other. Nobody actually identifies that way. But in these census forms and these, social studies, they ask them, how do you identify? And people who don't feel comfortable with the other categories say other. And I think they're on pace. I don't know if it's 2040 or what the exact decade is, but they're on pace within certainly both of our lifetimes, hopefully, to outnumber Black Americans, which is I think that's quite unique in American history because Americans have traditionally a very binary view of race. You're either black or you're white. And during apartheid South Africa, there was this problem of, what do you consider an Asian in South Africa? What do you consider an Indian versus Chinese versus then you have to create a category of coloreds to deal with people who are of mixed race heritage. So now we don't have those laws anymore in America. We don't have those racial laws, but we have these kind of informal cultural taboos or categories. And this has come up with Kamala Harris, where the question is she black? Is her blackness a matter of her expressions of how she publicly identifies herself, in the same way that we could talk about a gender expression, I identify as he, him pronouns? Or is her blackness something that we look at a genealogical chart, or we ask her parents, or do we do a genetic test? What determines her blackness? And I think where those sorts of questions are more sort of pronounced on the margins or in marginal cases, versus if you ask kind of the person on the street, can you distinguish between a white person, black person, Hispanic, and whatever? The average person on the street says, yeah, of course, you know it when you see it. But the thesis of your book, or this, especially that second part, I started to look at that, especially in the context of other historical identities, and it's difficult with race, because race, sometimes you can think of it as consubstantial with ethnicity, but there is this history, whether it's scientific racism, whether it's the concept of civilization or Christendom. There are all of these grandiose concepts that race it seems to like transcend the concept of ethnicity. So at the same time, I still want to be able to look at other ethnic groups and say, okay, are these other ethnic groups able to assimilate new people into that population, and even acknowledging a retention of certain traits? So the French Huguenots, like when they left France, did they cease being Huguenots, or did they retain that identity while at the same time assimilating into new cultures? When they went to Germany, one of the military orders, I think I don't know French, but like the Pour le Démérite or something. And you're like, why does the German military have a medal that's named in French? They're supposed to be German nationalists. And it's because the French Huguenots were so successful in the German military that they kind of got a medal named after them, in a sense. And, there are other examples. I think Judaism is interesting as an identity group that has morphed and changed over time, and yet retains some kind of core essential characteristics. One of the models that I would use with respect to Judaism, but I think it's applicable to other ethnic groups, is the idea that there is, I call it the onion model of ethnic identification, where at the core you have a group in Judaism. It's the Kohanim, who are, it's not just concerning intermarriage laws between Jews and non-Jews, but it's even within that caste. For Indians, there's a caste system that's kind of more complex and even differentiating. It's a Tamil Brahmin versus a Gujarati Brahmin. So these things can get very complicated, but the essential model is that there's a core group that highly values retaining its traditions, its characteristics, defining clear boundaries between the ethnic group and non-ethnics, and then from there you get these various shells, these various layers of increasing levels of assimilation. And like Judaism is an excellent example for this, because you have that Orthodox Jewish core, which has kind of always remained, or religious scholars equivalent, but they conceive of themselves as having remained the same throughout history, 2,000 years. But then you have Reform Judaism, which is much more assimilation. So then you have a compromise between the two as conservative Judaism. And in Israel, it kind of, the gamut sort of expands with Haredi, the religious as non-Haredi religious, and then, Reform, and then people, Hilonim, completely secular, and maybe even people who are outside that. or an even further level beyond that, like an anti-Zionist Jew living in Israel or something like that. So you have these various levels of ethnic identification. And in terms of white people, because of the American experience, and some say the one drop rule, that it's difficult to conceive of the idea of a core white population, and then sort of these levels, these onion rings around that of whitish people, where their dominant identity is white, but there's also something else going on. There's something else mixed in there, and this was a question with Barack Obama, to give another example. 50% white, 50% black people identify him as black. And so there seems to be this sense in which marginal minorities, in order to resist assimilation or to assert themselves and to gain a sense of identity, they have to, in a sense, be stronger or more dominant than the majority ethnicity, which has no sort of, you'd say, like an identitarian, immunological self-assertion. Like, white people don't need to assert themselves as white because they're the majority, whereas if you're a marginalized group, you come from a minority group, there's a greater need to kind of assert your identity, to be proud of your identity. Otherwise, you kind of get lost in the system, so to speak, or you lose that uniqueness. So I think that the model you're proposing, I think the reason why it has some kind of predictive power is because there are these studies in terms of immigration, demographic shift, where as white people become more aware of the shifting demographics, they tend to express stronger levels of in-group preference, ethnic in-group preference. And so if that's happening, you're going to get these interesting cases where mixed race people are starting to identify as white. And online especially, that's been, I mean, there are examples of that where people, not even who are necessarily white themselves, but Kanye West, who is in an interracial relationship with Kim Kardashian, Candace Owens, who has a white husband. There's a sense in which even people who are in mixed race marriages, I think, have been identified, by other black people or something of, oh, you're identifying more with whites. You're not identifying with us anymore. So this is maybe a really complicated way to introduce these ideas. But I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you specifically was, when we talk about this group, other people who are white plus something else, it's a small, right now it's kind of a small percentage of the population. And so to drill down into saying someone who's half white, half Asian, half black, half white, that sort of thing, it's hard to get data on that because a lot of it's just not being recorded. But are there any trends that you're kind of picking up on, or that you found in your research, that indicates to you sort of which of those sort of pairings or mixed race groups are more likely to veer toward what we might say a pro-white identity or something like that, versus the ones who are less likely?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is we actually do have data. Now, Richard Alba is sort of one of the leading writers in this. His book, I think it's called The Great Demographic Illusion. The exact title's escaping me. So he's summarized a lot of this data. And the long and the short of it is, black-white admixture tend to identify as black more, and white Asian, white Hispanic admixture tends to identify towards white somewhat more. And I think that's sort of roughly in the U.S. kind of the pattern. Now, of course, you have other little wrinkles, both in Britain and the U.S. Offspring of black-white intermarriages are, I believe, I can't exactly remember the U.S. numbers, but are substantially likely to partner with whites. So there is, even though they may identify more with blacks, their actual partnering behavior tends to be more towards white. So that's kind of interesting. And so in both cases, I think you see this assimilation trend. The other thing I would say is, just in terms of the discussion, which is fascinating, about this question of the onion, people have an ethnic identity. Like, if the classic case would be something like either Native Americans, or if you go to Africa, people will have a kind of tribal identity, and then above that they'll have If we take Nigeria, they might be an Igbo, and they'd have their tribal, then there'd be the Igbo, then there'd be a Southern Christian, then a Nigerian. You have these kind of different layers, um, and that does exist. But what I would say is clearly the more mobile and modern a society has been over a long enough period of time, a lot of European countries, a lot of those tribal affiliations, I mean, those would have been broken up by empires and dynasties and so on. And so you might have regional identities, but those are not really connected to genealogy so much because there's a lot of movement between regions. I think in the case of the U.S., you again see that yes, there are Irish and Italian and German Americans, but the reality is that very few of those people are only Irish or Italian or German, and especially as you get younger. So you had this melting pot, which has broken down, I think, a lot of the fixity there. And the identity is, I mean, in some ways, the Anglo symbols, well, what you have is a competition of two symbolic repertoires within that identity. I mean, one is the sort of, Pilgrim Jamestown, settling of the West kind of narrative. And then the other is the sort of Ellis Island urban immigrant narrative. And I would say that, however, also culture, culturally, there are certain white cultures that are, let's just say that whites are more likely to do certain things, to go to rodeos or listen to country music. Doesn't mean that others aren't doing it, but they would be more likely to do that or listen to heavy metal or something. So there are certain kind of things that are more prototypical of whites, and so you have certain mass cultural practices which would begin to define this pan-ethnic group. That's not to say, though, that there aren't subgroups like Jews or Mormons that might be distinctive enough or Amish to maintain a sub-identity, but for a lot of white Americans, they have been blended into this new construct, which, like most ethnic groups, a lot of ethnic groups have competing narratives, and this would be one that is perhaps hasn't settled on a singular narrative for itself. It's more confused. Whereas the old Anglo-Protestant, well, that was also split between North and South, so you didn't actually have a singular narrative there either. But you could say that again, it's somewhat divided as to which narrative you identify with. And in fact, partisanship plays into this. One of the things you see is that white Americans who identify with both the Jamestown founding fathers and settlement of the West narratives are much more likely to be Republican, and those who reject that are much more likely to be Democrats. So, and that's what we've seen in history. In Britain, the Whigs in the 19th century identified with the Anglo-Saxons, and the Tories with the Normans and the Norman dynasties. So that's something we've seen in many groups over time.
Yeah, I specifically wanted to ask you about partisanship when we're talking about competing myths or narratives of identity. You specifically mentioned saying that children of black-white pairings are more likely to identify as black than white, and yet in terms of their marital preference, they're more likely to marry white than black. So, kind of going off of that, like a split or a divide between sort of the maybe conscious or external self-identification and then maybe sort of the unconscious choices that people make in their dating lives. Within whites, there are broadly speaking, a partisan divide between conservatives and liberals that, from what I can see, is starting to supplant and replace other sorts of sexually selective identities like religion, for example, that 50 years ago, a Catholic marrying a Protestant, I mean, it was never illegal in America, but there was some sort of familial stigmatization. I mean, in the Jewish community, certainly 60 years ago, it was very different. And again, I'm not talking about Orthodox. I'm not talking about, something extreme. I'm just saying mainstream Jewish culture. If you wanted to marry out, there was heavy disapproval, and people care about what their family thinks, and so that plays a role. So I guess the point that I'm coming to here is that I think for both conservative whites and liberal whites, when you ask the question, would you mind if someone in your family married someone of a different race? There's been a consistent decrease in concern over that. It's not a big deal. But in terms of partisanship, would you be okay with a member of your family marrying someone from a different political affiliation? That seems to be increasing. And that seems to be part of polarization. Now, it's possible if polarization halts or reverses, that might also halt and reverse. But if we assume that maybe polarization is going to continue, then my almost question there is if these political affiliations are now viewed as more important than race, more important than religion, at least in terms of marital approval, then are we not, again, taking more of a 100-year view rather than the present day, but are we sort of seeing sort of an ethno-religious genesis or a split within whites? If conservatives only marry conservatives and liberals only marry liberals, and there are these kind of socioeconomic or cultural differences between the two, one tends to live in urban areas, one tends to live in rural areas. I mean, we could go down the line all the demographic differences. But do you see a potential there for kind of differential or ethnic differentiation within whites on that kind of global left versus right basis?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I guess demography, which is one of the hats I wear, there are certain kind of rough rules for these long term projections. One is that a certain amount of mixing will often be enough to prevent substantial divergence between populations. And so, as long as there is a substantial flow between these groups, and also there's a significant number of people who convert from one state to the other. Let's say they're raised conservative and they become liberal. So those things will tend to mitigate the separation into the two. But you're right that particularly Democrats and liberals, I mean, let's just say, if you look at dating preferences, I think I just had a number, I think it's under 10% of non-Trump voting women would say that, sorry, let me get this right. So non-Trump voting female students, it's only 7% who said that they would be happy to date a Trump supporter. I think a lot of this, at least at the elite level, is coming very heavily from the sort of liberal and Democrat side, particularly female. Now, in practice, I mean, in order to find partners, probably, somebody's going to have to compromise. So I can only assume that these barriers are going to fall at some point. The other thing to note is that if they don't fall, if these two groups were to remain separate, because of the birth rate differentials, clearly the conservative group would rapidly become much larger than the liberal group. I don't think that's likely to happen because of the amount of switching, and I still think there'll be substantial mixed marriage, to use that metaphor. So yeah.
I mean, I think you make a great point there, which is that because liberals don't have children at replacement rate, they need to constantly convert conservative children to their cause, which they've been very successful in the last 50 years of doing that. And I project that they will continue to do that. But at the same time, something about the way that and I'm not entirely clear about this, but my suspicion is that the rise, like the internet, I view as a kind of hyper-urbanism. So let's say we lived in medieval France, and we lived in a little village, and it's a village of a few hundred people, and at any given time, 10% of people are unmarried of marital age. They're at the right age and they're not married. And so, there's like 10 boys and 10 girls who can get married. And if you're an exceptional individual, or you're a very picky, choosy individual, well, good luck. You got 10 choices to make. So there's not a lot of assortative mating going on in rural communities. But as we become more urban and you decrease the geographic space, and as people begin to socialize in more specialized ways, so they find subcultures, whether that's uh, via their workplace or their education level or their interests or their hobbies or whatever. They're allowed to be more selective based on not just geography, but also in terms of, yeah, what are your political views? What is your taste in music and so on? And so as people are becoming more, they have the ability to be more selective due to urbanism. We now have these dating apps that allow people to be hyper selective. I mean, I could never go on as many speed dates as I could, flip back and forth on an app like that. And so, you're taking, it sort of reminds me of uh, the tendency for corporations to demand a college degree even where none is required, because you have this huge stack of resumes and you have limited time to interview people, so we'll just throw away the ones that don't have a college degree. And in the same way, I see people becoming hyper selective and hyper choosy in who they're going to date. 7% are open to dating a Trump supporter. It doesn't matter. He's 6'5". He earns $200,000 a year, whatever. Nope. We're throwing that resume out. And so when it's kind of when there's that sort of sexual marketplace, then I think both men and women actually. I mean, there's a narrative that only women are becoming more choosy in that sense, but I think both sexes are actually becoming less compromising, less, kind of, oh, well, you do you, I'll do me, and we'll figure it out. And people are sort of sorting by what may have in the past been considered superficial qualities. Like, I don't think 50 years ago it was that important that, your husband be a Republican or a Democrat, unless you worked for the party or something. Very few people did. And now that's becoming more important. And I just see that as I think that is probably the statistic that stands out most to me. But I think there are probably a number of other things that people are selecting for, like taste in music, that are hyper specific and perhaps not actually relevant to overall marital success. Like whether someone likes the same music as you. Sure, you go to a few concerts but on a day-to-day basis, does that predict the level of conflict in the relationship, and whether you're able to enjoy spending the rest of your lives together and raise children together and so on? Those things actually might be more related to something like geography or whether your family gets along or something like that. So yeah, I see that I see that sort of selection as on the surface, there's like a paradox of choice, or you think giving people choice in their mating is going to improve marital outcomes and the ability to form lifelong connections, but maybe people are not rational creatures in that way.
Well, one of the questions, yeah, I don't know, and this is sort of maybe more your generation than mine, since I've never been on a dating app. But what I would say is that there may be a greater discomfort with difference, or with something that's uncomfortable, I guess. Somebody having a different trait, liking a different kind of music. Clearly, in the past, there's no question that, if someone had a different religion, that was a barrier, and almost an absolute barrier. So I don't think we should pretend there weren't these things that mattered. However, that was structured around community. And so now this it's interesting that this sort of ideological partisan taboo is, or not taboo, but let's just say boundary line is emerging. I guess I'm still a bit skeptical. It's a bit like a lot of these Gen Z trends, like the 25% LGBT, or the crazy mental health trends. I just kind of think, at some point, something's going to have to give there. And I just don't think that these things are likely to persist. So I would just say probably people are going to have to settle for some things they don't like, maybe at age 30 instead of age 20 or 25. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to be without a partner. And so I just don't see that continuing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're going to bear down and say, no, I absolutely will not marry anyone who doesn't share my political preferences, come hell or high water.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
I yeah.
that's very interesting. I mean, I think I would look at the example of sort of East Asian nations like Japan, where a lot of people, and in fact, in Japan, and I don't have the data on this, but anecdotally, watching some documentary or something, it seems like the men have kind of just tapped out. They're just like, not really interested in forming a family or anything. I live my life, I do what I please, and the women are kind of like, where's the men? Like, I don't think that narrative is as strong in America. I think there's still a sense of male indignancy of, oh, I want women to be this certain way, and they're not conforming to the way, and they should listen to me. Yeah, there seems to be a stronger culture of that in America, the more blame on women for it. So I don't know how far some of these trends can go. I don't know, okay, in Seoul, South Korea, we're at zero point 0.7 TFR. Can we reach that in
Yeah.
America? Is that possible, or because we're an important country, at some point someone steps in and just says, "Okay, we're not doing this anymore. We're changing,
Well,
changing."
well, the birth rate thing's interesting. I mean, that's there's a whole literature on the drivers of that. I mean, one thing in the developed world, really, attending, people who attend religious services on a regular basis have a replacement level fertility rate in Western countries. People who say they have no religion is kind of pushing towards 1.0. I mean, it's pretty low. So religion is kind of an absolutely key thing in terms of correlates with fertility rates in Western countries. Now, of course, if we take Europe, there are very few people who attend regularly, like it's maybe 5% of the population. But in the U.S., that's much higher. So one of the reasons the U.S. birth rate is higher than that of many, not all, but many Western European countries is it's a more religious country, even though that's dropped a lot, and it's dropped a lot amongst millennials and Gen Z, but it's still several, 4 times, let's say, even Gen Z would be 4 times more religious in America. And so I think that's going to mean the drop in total fertility rate is going to be less. It's not going to go quite to the level of these East Asian countries where there's effectively little to no religion at all. And that kind of explains why they are such outliers, along with other things perhaps to do with, there's many other factors people like to toss in, like living in apartments. I lived in Tokyo for 8 years, and a house is unheard of, certainly in Greater Tokyo. Maybe that's a factor, as well as this. There's this argument that you have this kind of U-shaped, very patriarchal societies like Afghanistan have a high birth rate. The kind of very egalitarian Scandinavia, France, or whatever, has a reasonably healthy birth rate. It's not. It may be between 1.5 and 2, but it's the sort of in-between societies, Southern Europe, where women are emancipated, but there's still certain patriarchal norms, like you can only have kids within a family. Getting divorced and remarriage is frowned upon. Those have the lowest birth rates, because actually, where you have divorce and remarriage, where it's easier to move in and out of marriage, you actually have higher. Oddly enough, you have higher birth rates overall. And so one of the factors in the US and in Northern Europe is that you can get divorced, you can remarry and have a kid. And so that actually props up the birth rate a certain amount.
Yeah, I saw some interesting data from Norway, because there's, one of the, I think, someone like Elon Musk, who's a pro-natalist, I think one of, maybe not something that he himself says, but I think within the pro-natalist movement, there is a concern that, well, humanity as a whole has replacement breed, so we're not going extinct as a species. But when you consider that first world populations and the most educated and the most urban and the most highly skilled and so on and so forth, they have the lowest birth rate. And then it's a third world population where there's less education. It's difficult to assimilate those cultural norms, even if they do immigrate. And so there's this concern that the most educated people are having the least children. And I think that probably remains true in Norway when we split the genders and look at just women. And probably overall that might even be true. But the data actually, when it split out men, and I've been able to find this in not just Norway, but I think even America, it at least trends more in that direction, that the least educated men actually have the least number of children, and the most educated. Now, it's not a huge difference, but it is an opposite trend line to what you see when you just look at the overall data.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Actually, what we're seeing now in the West and have for about 10 to 15 years is that kind of hockey stick. I'm a Canadian. I like these metaphors, but where if you start with the least educated and go to women with a BA, you get a falling birth rate. So women with a BA have lower uh, fertility than women with like less than grade, with just a grade school education. But once you go from BA to master's or higher degree, you actually get an increase in the fertility rate. Part of that, I think, is just to do with the correlation with wealth. So if you have an advanced degree, you're probably well off as a woman, and you may well be married to a very high earner. That affords you the opportunity to stay at home. And so if the wealthier areas have a higher share of stay-at-home moms, and so that being a stay-at-home mom is correlated very much with higher birth rates. So I think that's what's going on there. If I had to say why the masters and above women have higher birth rates than the bachelor's degree women.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And to go back to something we were talking about earlier about the fact that, well, even if liberals never married a conservative ever again and vice versa, there's still going to have to be some kind of interchange because the liberals just aren't having babies. But then if we stop talking about liberals as a grand category of all liberals and we focus in on those PhDs, then I think there's this is not a population-wide trend in the way that we talk about, blacks and whites as tens of millions of people in America. But if we zoom in on maybe we're talking about more on the scale of hundreds of thousands, then you're talking about people who maybe, and I think Rob Henderson talks a little bit about this, how rich and wealthy people tend to espouse very liberal beliefs on marriage and say, oh, marriage is a social construct. You don't need to get married. And then you're like, well, you're married and you have 2.3 kids and you live in the white picket, you live this, kind of conservative lifestyle in terms of your behaviors, even though you kind of advocate libertinism for everybody else. So that goes back to that onion model concept that maybe there is a core group of liberals who they have this very stable life structure, everything's put together, going back to Charles Murray, like these are the, what is it, Fishtown, and I forget the other one.
Oh yeah, the super zips, the kind of I'm trying. Was Belmont because they're based
Yeah,
on
Belmont. These are your
Belmont. Yeah.
Belmont PhD educated liberals who they're never going to be a majority of liberals, but they're going to be this core intellectual elite leadership that sort of intergenerationally reproduce liberalism and then disseminate these libertine ideas to the broad masses of liberals who then follow them and listen to what they say. I mean, maybe Taylor Swift doesn't have any children right now, but this kind of the idea that someone like a Taylor Swift kind of has a stable home environment and has a family, but then the fans are going to only hear the message and not see kind of what's or see that contradiction or understand that hypocrisy. I saw a picture of the Kennedy family recently, and it's just this huge family. They care incredibly about their family values and keeping the family together. Some would even accuse them of nepotism. I won't comment on that, but it's like a huge family. They're like a clan, and I mean, you look at them and it's like this looks very conservative from the outside, but then sort of the policies, with the exception of RFK, the policies that most of them advocate are fairly liberal. So that's kind of maybe the model I'm pointing toward, is that there's a very large number of American conservatives who attend church regularly. We're talking about millions and millions of people. They live in rural areas. This is Trump country. And then there's this very small, maybe hundreds of thousands at most, PhD educated liberals in ivory towers who actually do have sustainable fertility rates and kind of do have this concept of, well, we're liberals, but we're liberals in this kind of oddly conservative way where there's a weird sort of ethnocentrism to it, I guess is what I'm pointing to in the long term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the one thing, well, what I would say is, I mean, I think probably if we were to look at masters and PhD very highly educated people in America, I suspect we would see a significant birth rate difference between liberals and conservatives. And the thing is to say, there are a lot of college educated and even advanced degree educated conservative people. And we often forget that when we just look at top line numbers like, oh, well, look, it's 65-35 Democrat amongst, people with advanced degrees. Yeah, but it's still 35% Republican. And especially if you look within whites, it might even be slightly higher than that. So that's just a lot of people. And so I think if I were to say, I think the very well educated liberals are probably having fewer kids. And one way that might manifest is that maybe very well educated liberal women are less likely to be stay at home moms than very well educated conservative women. Because we know from the data, for example, that homemaker, people who put down homemaker as their occupation, like the stay at home moms, are very Trump leaning, regardless of education. So I think it is a complete luxury belief. So I think there's probably a degree to which those very well educated liberals are having fewer kids. Now they're staying married, I think. So they are married, but they are having fewer kids. The other thing I would say is that they're also selecting into very wide areas. So if you look at residential patterns, I've looked at this in a academic paper I did a few years ago. I mean, there's no difference between Trump supporters and Trump haters, in Britain between Brexiteers and Remainers. Essentially there is no residential difference. Though those white liberals are moving towards areas that are every bit as white conservatives. So that's I think another way in which we aren't seeing people practicing what they preach. I'm not sure that's so much a luxury, but like the belief in diversity, and then just to espouse diversity and flee diversity. You could say, is this a luxury belief? I don't know. I mean, it's one I have to think over. They're certainly being a bit hypocritical, but why they're doing it, the motivation. And one area I take issue to some degree with Henderson is I'm not sure this is so much driven by status and sort of wanting to escape the consequences of your belief system. I think it's just I'm more of a believer in kind of true belief that they have really invested in this set of values and they really do believe in them, and that's what's motivating them.
Yeah, I think most of them do believe what they say they believe. I think I am skeptical of the concept of luxury beliefs generally. I think there are some kind of anecdotal or fringe examples where perhaps like Noam Chomsky is opposed to the war in Ukraine, and he's like the darling of the left. He's a a big hero for the left. And then now that the left is a pro-Ukrainian kind of thing, he's sort of side like we don't care anymore. And so to an extent, left-wing isolationism or left-wing anti-interventionism, as soon as there's some exigency, as soon as like push comes to shove, it's like, yeah, we're jettisoning that. Yeah, we don't care about that anymore. And so, there are some senses in which you could say, maybe something is a luxury until we have to go to war or something, and then those beliefs aren't really counted anymore in the way that they were in peacetime. But overall, yeah, I'm skeptical of the and I guess I don't have a problem with the idea that people tend to gravitate toward moral views from a very early age in childhood prior to any rational ability to evaluate those moral views. So if you grow up in a Christian society, you become Christian. You grow up in a Muslim society, you become Muslim, and so on and so forth. And that's a response to, you could say, a social economy that people see, okay, if I believe these beliefs, I'm good. If I believe those other beliefs, I'm bad. Therefore, I choose the good beliefs without any kind of epistemic knowledge or something. And this happens at a very young age. And then these are later rationalized by forms of true belief in adulthood. But I wouldn't call that a luxury. In the same way that I wouldn't say, if you get a PhD and you work on Wall Street and you earn a lot of money, your desire to earn money and to be high status, that's like a luxury. No, it's like when people are competitive, whether it's they're competitive in a financial market, they're competitive in academia, they're competitive morally speaking. That to me isn't a desire for luxury, it's a desire for power. And people desire power, they desire control over their own lives, they desire independence. And if they feel that money or status, education, or certain moral positions are helpful toward attaining power, then they might gravitate toward those things and engage in rationalization of them, even if they have to make certain logical compromises or something like that. So I think maybe when I describe that process, that probably has a lot of similarities with things Rob believes, but just the label of luxury implies that, oh, well, in the past we didn't have such luxuries as the woke, and therefore we were a totally rational. It's like, no, there are many primitive, very poor people around the world who have rather, the beliefs that I would think are crazy, and I wouldn't call them luxury beliefs. I would say that there is a certain moral regime that has taken root, and it's sort of a matter of existential survival that people engage in this cargo cult where they're, worshiping something that I find to be silly. But yeah, I think even though, yeah, we have more luxury, we have more wealth in Western societies. I'm generally like skeptical of the idea that like wokeism or extreme left wing beliefs are a product of wealth in themselves. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
as convinced of that. I'm not even convinced that they're a product of education in a universal sense. I think they're a product of a specific kind of education, but not in like some universal, oh, any education, throughout time or history is necessarily going to lead to these specific beliefs. That's a bit of a
Yeah.
stretch.
I agree. I think that, it's very interesting right now. If you were to take, you know, I think, for example, being woke, let's say believing that trans women are women, or, I actually think if we were to talk about raw status, I don't think these beliefs necessarily have the highest intellectual status. Whereas I think believing in free speech and the pursuit of truth actually has a higher status. And I think one of the reasons you see mainstream media basically basically going in the direction of free speech. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post and these places, yes, they had a very brief dalliance with 1619 and these various ideas, but I think it moved away from it. So I think we're in interesting, and also within academia, grievance studies has a low status compared to very advanced quantitative or formal theory or any of these other things. And it's an interesting one. So I think that the status and the kind of, I guess, whoever has the moral high ground, let's say, the moral high ground and the status high ground are not in the same place, actually. And so it's an interesting test, I think, of some of these arguments. I'm just not sure if you espouse a woke belief in a seminar room that people will think, ooh, that's a very high status thing to do within the academy. Whereas if you say I published in this top quantitative journal and you take a very detached, sophisticated point of view, I think you get more status from it in academia. So I think, and the other thing I think is a lot of the texts of the luxury beliefs, and Zach Goldberg at Manhattan Institute looked at this, and actually you don't see a correlation of, let's say people who espouse very soft views on crime necessarily living in lower crime areas than people who espouse very tough views on crime when you control for all the other usual covariates. So I think empirically we're also not finding that evidence. And there are examples of, real true bleeding heart liberals who, live and work in these poor ghetto areas and they wind up getting victimized and actually they're living out their beliefs. I think that is truer to what I think is going on. Now, it is, of course, true that, white liberals who say they love diversity are clustering in very white areas. And that's a contradiction. But I'm just not sure. I think there's a fair point. I think Rob makes a fair point that people who aren't confronting the consequences of their beliefs, it's easier to hold those beliefs. Maybe if all of those white liberals were forced to live in highly diverse environments, they may change their views a certain amount. But but I still think, as you say, there's problems.
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of things in there. One is, do we view status as a linear quantity like money? So in America, we have the Federal Reserve, we have the greenback, and ultimately, even if you own stocks or crypto or so, you think you own you own bars of gold or something. Generally speaking, people only value those things because you can convert them to dollars. I mean, realistically speaking, they may say, "Oh no, this is the new alternative." Well, that has yet to be proven, and so effectively, we can say that money in America is a linear quality where there's more and there's less. Whereas with status, is that necessarily the case? Now, let's say I take a picture with Trump and I post it to Facebook. There's, that 93% of college age educated women are going to say that's low status. But there's going to be some Moms for Trump Facebook group that's going to say that's high status. That's really cool that you got a photo with Trump. So I think whereas things like money, and when we try to correlate status and money, we start to run into these paradoxes because it's not actually a linear monolith. There's actually different types of status, right? Referencing early dating markets, there's going to be an alternative community, and they listen to a certain type of music, and you can gain greater status within that community. That's then not exchangeable for status in another parallel community. And so the development of American subcultures, and you're seeing this online. I mean, you've got these little Substack communities and these little Twitter communities, and people are jockeying for status online. But you can't just sell your status in one thing and then go buy it somewhere else. It's limited. There's no the exchange rate. There's a huge taxation on exchange rate to try to transfer from one area to another. And some people, maybe a guy like you reach a certain threshold, RFK can cash in his Democrat points for some Republican points or something. But that's the average person doesn't have access to that. And so I guess when we say are people, when someone espouses a pro-trans belief, is there a desire on their part for greater status as a result of that belief? Now, I think probably directly, I don't think there's any part of the conscious mind for most of those people espousing that belief that says, "Oh, I'm cynically espousing this just to gain status." But I would say that everybody wants to be part of an identity group. Everyone wants to be accepted. And it sort of in various interviews, again, this isn't a quantitative approach, but just listening to the interviews of people who are detransitioners, they've left that community, and they describe their motivations. Why did you want to be part of that community? They say, well, I was homeschooled, and then I was thrown into high school, and I didn't have any friends, and I was the weird kid. And so I hung out with the other weird kids, and all of them were trans, and I wanted to fit in with them, so I became trans. Now, is that a status game? Is that people trying to gain status? I think it is, but I think one of the problems when we say, "Oh, people just want status," we make it sound like this Machiavellian. They're rubbing their hands together and think, "Oh, I'm going to pull something over on these people." Actually, it's the opposite. Is people sort of fool themselves into true belief, into believing things that they otherwise wouldn't because they want to be loved and accepted, which is a form of status at the end of the day. It's just not this kind of cynical Machiavellian game that might be imagined.
Yeah, I mean, God, there's a lot in there. I mean, I guess because I'm sort of a social scientist, and I incline towards, I'm more of a splitter of concepts than a lumper of concepts. So I kind of like these neat, clean divisions between something like status and something like identity and something like money. What I would say is I think in the, let's say, the institutions that have more power and money attached to them, which would be, large corporations, maybe government or elite universities or so on. I do think there are a set of values that are seen as more prestigious in some way than others. And so I do think it still makes sense to talk about a dominant set of status values, even though you might have subcultures. Yes, within the ultra-Orthodox Jews, being a top Torah scholar is really what women go for. I know that, but but maybe in the rest of society, having a big bank account matters more. And so I still think it makes we can still talk about, even though it's not totally uniform, a certain set of status beliefs. And what's interesting is those can change over time. If you look at the belief in temperance, the banning of the sale of alcohol, that was a high status belief in 1890. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the women who ran that were elite women. By the time we get to the repeal of prohibition, the movement to repeal prohibition in the 20s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is now the class background of the leadership has dropped from upper middle down to lower middle or working class, and the prohibition repeal coalition is very much upper middle. And I think there you kind of see where the status of temperance as a belief system had fallen, and you can see it in the class background of the leadership. So I think something similar, we could try and apply that lens. So what's occurred is a set of left liberal beliefs have become, and left liberalism on steroids, which is what I would call woke, that has become a prestige belief system. Now, I think it's lost some prestige over the last few years due to its excesses, and it's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out and manifests itself. Will it go down the way temperance went down and be replaced by something else? I think the reason I'm skeptical about that is because it's not just a status belief. Yes, people change their views on temperance for a whole bunch of reasons, but so I think it's not just simply about status, but there is a very strong kind of moral dimension that the more I can be empathetic towards historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities, the more moral a person I am. That is the way our entire moral order has been constructed around what Jonathan Haidt would call the care, harm, and equality foundations as they pertain to these three Holy Trinity identity totems. That's kind of our moral order until that actually substantively shifts. Until something like, say, free speech and truth and other kinds of values become higher up that pantheon, I don't think we're going to get a fundamental change, even if the excesses of woke have been trimmed back, even if it's lost a certain amount of status in these elite institutions. There's still nothing obvious that's going to push it off its pedestal.
Yeah, I know. I agree that these things sort of have inertia, and even if something, I look at the early Christian churches that there were many different stages and waves of early Christianity. It was not a homogenous, and it wasn't a linear movement either. There were, phases of early Christianity that were full-on communism. There was no private property; everything was shared. And then they said, we got to scale that back a little bit and sort of moderate the message. But that didn't mean that Christianity disappeared entirely as a movement. It meant it kind of adjusted, it recalibrated, and then it ultimately marched on it and became dominant and became successful. In the case of the beliefs that you're describing, in a sense, even this term, it's denying the fundamental reality you're pointing out, which is that these beliefs are very long-standing at a fundamental root level. That, the expression might be new in its aesthetics, it might be new in its rhetoric or its vocabulary or its particular visible characteristics, right? A drag queen is a very stark image that was not associated with Martin Luther King or an earlier iteration of the left. And so that jarring, almost an inverted populism, right? When you see like a pro-abortion rally and there's, some woman with the red lettering on her bare chest that says, my body, my choice or something, that's shocking to the average person. Whereas, something, whatever Margaret Sanger was doing 100 years ago, most people weren't really aware. It was sort of semi-intellectual. If anything, she was kind of aware of the fact that people might be apprehensive about abortion, and so she was trying to appeal to people and justify it based on, whatever was popular. If it was racism was popular, she would appeal to that. If something else was popular, she'd appeal to that. I guess I fundamentally agree with you that just because certain trappings or certain expressions or visible aesthetics might be tempered or downplayed or something like that doesn't mean that the fundamental roots of this organism have been torn out and it's discarded and we're in the dying phases of it. And part of the reason is because I think in general, whether we're talking about a state or a culture or religion, even in cases where these are very much weakened or people are sort of apathetic or agnostic about them, as long as there is not a viable alternative, the law of inertia just states it will just kind of go on indefinitely. I mean, the Roman Empire sort of went on until it was invaded. The Parthians sort of went on until they were invaded as well. And so I just don't see at this point a lot of people talk about, well, the alternative to this Western wokist thing is like a multipolar order from China, from Russia, something like that. And I think that that comes down to a geopolitical disagreement, that those systems are really have the ability to project that kind of soft cultural power outward, even if they had a total GDP that was superior to ours, even if they had a superior military or something, they just don't have that a competing religious system that can, tap into our mythology and change it at that fundamental level. And I'm not even sure what it would. I mean, Maoism or something that's very particular to Chinese people. Putinism is very particular to Russia, whereas the entire appeal of Western leftism is that it's meant to be universal. It's meant to apply to everyone. And I see it as being part of a long line of universalist and imperialistic religions, even going back to Judaism, Zoroastrianism, various forms of Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism. These were all religions that for their time were very inclusive, tried to rise above particularities, tried to even I mean, kind of this is a theory about Judaism, but I take the concept of the 12 tribes seriously, not as a pure mythology, but actually to say that there were multiple ethnicities, there were multiple nations that were brought together into a religious coalition effectively. So yeah, I see that as there's an underlying logic behind why this is a resilient ideology, even though, sure, there are taxes or there is friction or there is a cost, especially in terms of legitimacy. So you talk a little bit about the status within an institution, like being a physicist is more high status than being a gender studies major. But at the same time, we've noticed this remarkable, especially among conservatives, a remarkable decrease in the amount that they value these institutions, that they trust these institutions, whether it's doctors, lawyers, academics, you name it. They seem to just kind of be dropping out and not caring, being apathetic or even hostile, and saying, actually, if you're an expert in your field, I know that means you're a liar. If you have a PhD, I know that you're a liar. And so I guess that's a corollary. As much as we were asking this question, is wokeism going to increase, decrease, stay the same? There's kind of this reactionary movement from certain conservatives who are just sort of saying, no, I'm not sending my kids to college. That's all woke there. And not seeing the value in it, even though there is objective material value still to be found.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I think these things are ideological. So, for example, I've done survey work asking about trust in science, technology, engineering, math professors, social science, humanities professors. Now, there's a lot higher trust in science than in social science, humanities professors amongst Republicans. And I'm trying to remember how wide that gap was. It's a pretty wide gap. If you look at university-educated Republicans, they are even less trusting than non-university educated Republicans. And in a way, I think they're what that is reflecting is something kind of right, which is that if you take social science humanities profs, they are 80% on the left, let's say 75, 80. And they are very hostile to conservatism. It kind of makes sense that you wouldn't like them if you were on the right. And so, to some degree, it's kind of reasonable. Just the way, by the way, that liberals don't like the Supreme Court because they don't like the composition of the Supreme Court. Their trust in it has dropped So it's not so surprising. What is, and there's a lot of ignorance. So, for example, if you ask the average American what share of social science humanities professors are Republican, you'll get like 40%, you'll get 40, 45%. I mean, a lot of people don't really know how left wing the professoriate is. Those that do know, I think, are going to be more anti. So I think this loss of trust in these elite institutions is probably likely a reflection simply of their perceived partisan composition. And in many cases, that's a fairly accurate rendering. But now, does that mean you shouldn't trust, you know, academics and lawyers, whatever? No. But being skeptical of the kind of values that they're promoting, of their partisan bias, I think is legitimate. So the question is, how do we kind of balance these things out? I think skepticism towards universities and higher education from Republicans is in large measure warranted, even though a lot of academics are doing good work and producing interesting findings that are adding to human knowledge. So it's not a contradiction in a way, and I just wouldn't want to write that off entirely. But you're right that in some ways, conservatism is going to have to develop some rapprochement with the elite and elite institutions. I think the way that needs to happen is really through a reform program, a program not to abolish, but to try and reform these institutions to make them less biased in a way.
Yeah, I'm aware that there have been a few attempts to do that, and I've kind of lost track of them at this point. I know I actually think that maybe Chris Rufo is unique in this respect, in that he tried to take an existing institution he felt was most hostile to conservatism and just basically completely turn it around. One of the well, I hate to turn things on their head here, but when you have a kind of affirmative action for conservatives, there's a loss of competence. And so if you just say, well, we're going to change this institution as quickly as possible, well, then it kind of becomes a frat house in a sports school or something like that, rather than, this maybe like your institution, perhaps. But on the other hand, there are ideas that rather than trying to reform existing institutions, conservatives should just totally build from the ground up. We don't like the universities, we'll create a totally different university. So it sounds like you're more on the reform side of things. Can you just kind of explain what you think the value is of maybe reforming existing institutions rather than starting completely new ones?
Well, yeah, first of all, they have a lot of inbuilt advantages from first mover network effects, where they've got the prestige. The Ivy League has prestige. It's got alumni. It's got many people with a stake in keeping their prestige high and people's perceptions and everything. So I think there are just so many inbuilt advantages there, as well as their endowments. That it would make a lot more sense. You could affect a lot greater change by reforming the existing system. And if you just look at, for example, Twitter versus Gab, Parler, and Truth Social, Musk's takeover of Twitter was far more effectual than all of these alternatives that were set up, which were little silos. And now, I gather the left is trying to set up some alternative to Twitter. That's unlikely to succeed either, because the fact of the matter is you have to be, if you're on Twitter, and of course, the bigger it is, the more attractive it is, the more it generates its own, the rich get richer, kind of Matthew effect. So that's, I think, why we got to work mainly within existing institutions. Same with schooling, by the way. Sure, school choice, but that's only ever going to be a certain small share of the population. And even if you have school choice, if most of the education schools, most of the teachers, most of the teaching materials are being supplied by the same suppliers, it's not going to make any difference anyway to the content. And so again, there I think it's much better to try and reform, to root out, for example, critical race and gender theory out of instructions and get politics out of the classroom in the public system. That's going to have a much bigger effect. It's a bit like a Musk effect on Twitter. It's going to be much more substantial. And so even though I support these alternative institutions, I don't think it's not a free market. If we're talking about education, if we're talking about tech, even large tech platforms, these have inbuilt first mover effects and monopoly effects. These are not free markets. Now, it's different if we're talking about podcasts and even perhaps publishing and media. You have legacy media and legacy publishing, but with the internet, the barriers to entry are lower. It's possible to build up followings. So there, I take fine. The model is, free market, but I think for a lot of other areas, it's not, and it's going to require very detailed patient reform where you're into the weeds of what is being taught in the classroom. We're going to go through the curriculum. We're going to specify in great detail what we consider political and should not be taught. That kind of patient state-led legislative reform is, I think, going to make much more difference in education and in tech and in other areas than this idea of building an alternative set of institutions.
Yeah, I think the case of Musk was pretty dramatic, pretty night and day in terms of, well, first of all, I think he fired 90% of the people working at Twitter. So he went from a larger staff to a smaller one, and then from there, kind of made an example and said, look, you're either with the program or you're not, and people kind of fell in line, and because it is, ultimately, it's a very small number of people who are effectively not directly maybe controlling people in the same way that if your child is in a K through 12 system, they are kind of being directly inculcated and educated, in a very person-to-person level. Twitter is not as obvious and in your face and in the impact that it has, right? Elon Musk, a couple of his tweets might show up in your feed, but it's not like every day you log onto Twitter and you're forced through this, 8-hour seminar on Elon Musk's personal beliefs, right? He's not shoving his beliefs down your throat. He's just saying, you know what, let people kind of consume the content they want to consume. And if I want to boost Tucker, if I want to boost this person or that person at my discretion, whatever. But overall, the effect is just to remove from what is essentially an entertainment platform, to remove the regulations or the censorship that had been in place. Whereas with education, it's not as simple as just like firing people and removing people. You actually have to put people in place who believe what you want them to believe. And I guess I think that represents a much greater challenge. Now, even if there is a situation where Donald Trump is president for life or something, and the liberal nightmare comes true, democracy is over, and it's 9 conservative Supreme Court justices, and they all say, you know what, we're gonna get the CRT out of the schools, and we're gonna just teach non-political math, science, reading. That's what it is. Full stop. I think even then, with the full force of 3 branches of government bearing down on the education system, I still think it would be very difficult to actually ideologically change the class of people that are most likely to become teachers. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying, it might actually take you 5, 10, I don't know, 15 years to significantly change the needle, where you would actually see kind of a new crop of students emerge where they would say, oh yeah, we're not being taught this anymore, because teachers are sneaky. I mean, people teach what they want to teach, and you can have government say you're not allowed to teach that anymore, and there's still going to be that subtext. As we talked about before, I think wokeism is just a particular expression of deep-rooted moral principles and mythologies that were maybe more subtle in the past or more tastefully presented in the past, but now they've taken root, and unless there's a really forceful alternative to that, I don't know how well that would work. Now, that's in kind of the best conservative case scenario. The actual reality is that the presidency changes every 4 to 8 years, and who knows who has control of the Senate, the House, the Supreme Court. I mean, it's a conservative majority, but still. And so in that environment where things are constantly changing back and forth, even if you did institute certain reforms, it would be hard to keep those reforms permanent and not have it. For instance, Trump's immigration reform, right? Theoretically, the conservative narrative is he closed the borders, immigration was good for 4 years. Then Biden opened the borders. We had more immigration than ever before. So similarly with education, maybe you can stop CRT for 4 years, and then it's just doubled down and reinforced in the 4 years following. So yeah, I guess I'm very skeptical that I think you're making good arguments in the sense that when you're looking at these very large institutions that have a lot of funding. And I think the metaphor with Twitter is great, that like most people, they don't you're basically talking about an audience of people, and there is this natural monopoly that forms where you kind of have to go where the people are. And if the people are in the universities, that's where you have to go. And, trying to create a whole new parallel society is good luck with that. But at the same time, I'm very skeptical that conservatives will be able to win the kind of majorities that they need for that kind of legislative reform. And even if they did, I'm skeptical that it wouldn't just be reversed in the next cycle.
Right, but okay, there's a couple of points here. I mean, one is that if these beliefs are popular, so for example, controlling the border is popular, the Democrats haven't managed to do it. That is the single, if they lose the election, that's probably going to be the single biggest reason they lose. Probably next time round, when they are governing, when the activists come saying, you can't deport anyone that's racist, somebody somewhere is going to, maybe like a David Shore type figure or a James Carville type figure, will say, look, we can't do that. We got clobbered on this issue last time. We've got to moderate. And similarly, I think if a politician like Glenn Youngkin or Ron DeSantis is able to elevate critical race and gender ideology in schools as an issue and win on that, similarly, I think the left is going to learn that they can't simply indulge their activist base. So, and the other thing I would say is that I think it's, education, of course, is at a state level matter. And I think some states do have longer periods of one party dominance, the red states in particular. So I do think they will be able to bring in a new system. And the other thing is teachers, a couple of things. I mean, one is you can change the quality. So, for example, if you don't require university to become a teacher or to become a principal, you can change the accreditation. The other thing is the actual political beliefs of teachers, to the extent that I've seen data on this, is not as monolithic, I think, as the sort of curriculum is suggesting. So I think a small number of very woke teachers and administrators really set the tone in these schools, because no one can stand up to them. The people don't know the arguments against it. I think, therefore, and also with a kind of, you could have obviously leaks, from parents, from teachers about what's happening in a school. I actually think you can get quite a bit of compliance. And we're seeing that in places like Florida in the school system, where there's this, teachers are kind of scared. Now, that's might have gone a bit too far, but the chilling effect might be a bit too strong. But on the other hand, I think it is possible to actually get this stuff out of the school. Now, that's, again, not going to be nationwide. It'll be state by state. But I think that we know that these beliefs are unpopular within the general public. Teaching that the U.S. is a racist country has, at best, maybe a 25 to 33% support base, even in the blue states. So I think, actually, what this is about is just getting the public opinion reflected inside the institutions. And you're right, though, that if a Democrat, if there's a change of power, there will be a change of policy. But that's something, as long as it's elevated into public discourse, it's something people can vote on. And if it's costing the left, then they may moderate. And that's really where we want to get to, in a way, is a situation where that when they are in power, they don't push these policies because they know they're going to be costly.
It's an interesting question. So on immigration, I think there's two kind of factors here. There's the obvious material factor that the average American feels very threatened by immigration at a number of levels. So there's a cultural level, there's an economic level, there's a criminal justice level. And this isn't just a concern of middle-class people. This is a concern of people who are on welfare, because, the interviews I saw out of Springfield, Ohio, was saying these immigrants are stealing our welfare. They're getting more welfare than us. Now, for someone like me who maybe that's a low status thing to say, but, that is the authentic perception of these people, is that, as a person who's economically struggling, immigration is directly hurting me. I think that kind of populist message against immigration is pretty effective. So there's really no social class where, people are, it's very hard to find any, including immigrants. You can actually ask immigrants themselves, do you think illegal immigration is is good. And they're like, no, I'm glad I snuck across the border, but I don't want more people coming across. I've seen what they're like. I just came from there. I don't want more people coming. So yeah, obviously that's a uniquely unpopular issue for Democrats. I think the other side of that, though, and the reason why Democrats are kind of moderating their position, a couple of reasons. First of all, the idea that these people are instantly registering to vote and participating in elections. That's a bit, I'm a bit skeptical of that. How, obviously in some cases, does fraud ever happen? Sure. But I actually think if you compare where Democrats are winning demographically, it's not this flood of immigrants that's really changing elections. It's education. So if you look at states like Georgia or North Carolina, a lot of these previously Republican states are now sort of purple states. I think one of the big demographic trends that has led to that condition, it's not just immigration, but it's also the fact that people are becoming more educated, and especially among whites, the fact that as college attendance increases, they tend to vote Democrat. And so I think actually Democrats might be willing to say, oh, you know what? Hispanics are kind of trending Republican anyway. They don't vote very much. They're less than 10% of the electorate. It's not that important. College-educated whites, very important Democrat, not just for voting, but also in terms of who makes up the rank and file of the party members, the people who are going to go out and canvass and go, door knocking or whatever, whatever the Democrat Party does. I mean, they're the people who actually show up, become the city council member or whatever. And so they kind of have to cater to that group whether they want to or not, whether it's smart politically or not. They kind of have to, have some loyalty to that group because that's the group that on the ground level is kind of making a lot of these local decisions. And as a result, I think that Democrats actually are willing to kind of let the immigration issue go to an extent. But I think on the education issue, that's when you're going to see the claws come out. That's when people are going to say, yeah, no, you're not touching our I mean, now we're seeing that with other issues that are actually popular for Democrats, like abortion, right? Where a majority of people say, you know what, women's choice, let them do what they want to do. And that's why Democrats are leading with that for electoral purposes. But I think institutionally, there's actually there's this loyalty, this kind of in-group loyalty to education as an institution. And if Republicans like DeSantis threaten that, I wonder what the kind of response will be. I mean, I don't know what the status of the Democrat Party in Florida is right now, if they have the capacity to fight what he's doing. The federal government's not intervening under Biden. It's still considered sort of a states' rights thing. But if at a national level, there was a Republican president who said, I'm going to reform education, I'm going to totally change it. And it wasn't just window dressing, because remember, Trump said a lot of things about trans people in the militaries. Guess what? Trans people were still getting their surgeries paid for in the American military for all 4 years of what Trump was doing. So I mean, and there were the trans surgeries happening in the prisons too. So he had rhetoric on that didn't necessarily translate into policy. Whereas I think with the Democrats, their protectiveness of education, I think that's kind of the lifeblood of the party. And although that they might not lead with that platform because maybe it's not a popular thing with the majority of Americans, but institutionally, I think they would be much more threatened by that, at least on a national level.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I guess the question is whether, and this gets back to, is it interest versus true beliefs? I still am a believer in the whole true belief idea, in the sense that I think if you are awoke, if you think that is the center of the moral universe, and you think that deportation is tantamount to Jim Crow or being racist or something, and you're very allergic and hypersensitive to any taboo around that, I just think it's going to be very difficult to enforce a border. Or if you believe, you can't send anybody back who's claimed that, they're gay back in Nicaragua and they're going to get killed back there. And, I just think it's just very difficult for them to deport such people. And so I still think, even if Hispanics are not voting for them, they have no advantage with Hispanic. I just don't know that that's going to matter, because I've never believed that it's really about self-interest. In fact, this whole argument that they've encouraged immigration to help their vote, I don't think there's anything actually behind that. And in fact, the initial 1965 Hart-Celler bill, they were arguing that in fact, it wouldn't change the ethnic composition of the population. I think they sincerely kind of hoped or wanted or believed in that. I don't actually think they wanted to change the ethnic composition of the population, but they wanted to be able to kind of have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to be able to say we're non-discriminatory and generous, and that magically somehow it would change the composition of the. I think that's closer to the makeup of the Democrats around that issue. Education. I think the problem is that a lot of the woke beliefs around, critical race and gender ideology are just so unpopular. The more that the right elevates and is able to push those issues into public debate, the left strategy is to try and get them out of the public debate by saying you're stoking a culture war, you're being divisive, but if that's or it's not happening or whatever. But if the right persists as they have in places like Florida and Virginia, and they break through that and they're able to actually push this stuff into the public domain, it can be electorally costly, and especially with minority voters. I mean, in British Columbia, where I'm from, actually, there's just been an election where the non-white voters, mainly East and South Asian, have gone more conservative than the white population, and it's cost the left and quite a few ridings. And if that kind of trend continues, the right is going to try and push these issues more and more and more up the public consciousness. I just don't know whether the left is going to continue to be able to protect their clients in the education system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think there's two forces broadly at work here. There is kind of the populace at large, what is popular, what is not popular, and then there is sort of the financial theory of democracy that in a Senate election, in a congressional election, and in a majority of presidential elections, typically the candidate who has more funding wins, and so as a result of well, I think for the presidency that's the least true. I still think it's true in a majority of cases, but I think certainly in terms of the legislature, 70% of the time, 80% of the time, the candidate which has more money wins. Obviously, if I can't, Michael Bloomberg came out in 2020, said, I'm going to pour, $500 million into this thing. He got 10%, which is significant given the fact that he entered so late, but, he didn't win it. He then supported Biden, and Biden did win. So, yeah, I guess I think that there is a tension between what is available, what is possible in terms of relying upon public opinion polling. There's a lot of things. I mean, when you drill down into specifics and details, you will find plenty of policies that the American people just totally hate. They totally don't want anything, and yet they still exist. They're still there, and so part of it's an information problem. The average voter, to the extent that they are motivated to vote, are often motivated to vote for really big picture, sort of salacious, kind of in-your-face issues. Can CRT fit the bill in the same way that immigration or abortion represent these kind of, existential life and death? Our country is going to be killed if this and that. I mean, I guess I think that conservatives have and everybody has a limited attention span, and it's hard to, on the one hand, focus on immigration and say immigration is the issue and this is life or death, and then at the same time spend that political capital and energy on attacking CRT. And if I was a conservative and I was formulating strategy for them, I would say, look, immigration, those people don't even have citizenship, they can't vote. That's a future problem. We'll figure it out. Something is going to happen. But in the here and now, this education, you've seen what's happened, right? So since the 1960s, started in the universities, and then universities pump out teachers who go through K to 12, and it's a very clear trajectory. And so, immigration, who knows? Maybe it's going to, maybe the Democrats are going to get all the immigrant votes. Maybe it's going to be 50-50. Who knows? Like in your example, British Columbia, maybe actually conservatives can win second generation, third generation, whatever. But in the case of education, I think it's very clear that if you allow that system to keep doing what it's been doing, it's going to keep producing the same results. And so, if conservatives if they want to think about demographics, I think the most important demographic is Education. What's going on with education? But for a lot of people, that's a very abstract concept. It's not the meat and potatoes of immigration or abortion.
Well, what I'd say is this: is that it's all about how you connect issues together. I'll give you an example of an issue that nobody cared about in Britain, which was the membership of the European Union. Nobody rated that an important issue in their lives. You didn't see the impact of the EU anywhere. The genius of Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party was actually to connect the issue that nobody cared about, which is the European Union, to the issue they cared about, immigration, in such a manner that the argument was made: if we don't get out, we can't control our borders. And that is really what propels this issue up the agenda to the point it becomes a top issue for many voters on the right. So similarly, I think in the case of education, let's just say, if you had a skilled politician, maybe a DeSantis figure, who would say, if we want to control crime, control the border, if we want to have a decent medical system, if we want to have all kinds of things, we're going to have to stop the kind of propaganda that prevents us controlling crime, because certain races are more likely to wind up in jail, or controlling the border because, again, there's a somewhat of a racial difference between people entering and people in the country. So someone who is skillfully able then to raise the profile of culture wars issues by tying them to the bread and butter things people are kind of can see more visibly. And that would be kind of the way I would envision this thing happening, a bit like that elevation of the European Union in Britain. I think it's doable, but it would take a sort of concerted and focused kind of effort.
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say, and this is kind of ugly, but I think politics is ugly in general, is that the way that conservatives have tried to do that is by calling teachers groomers. Now, is that true that teachers are groomers? I mean, I don't think so, but it is a visceral way to communicate to voters: hey, these teachers are doing something bad, and the same rhetoric as cats and dogs, and the same rhetoric as, for the left, it's my body, my choice. Oh, if I got raped, you just let me bleed out in the parking lot. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. So that kind of like really salacious rhetoric, I think, is the way that, unfortunately, because voters are low information, they're kind of low in motivation. If you want to get them to the polls, you do have to put things. I think J.D. Vance basically said this: is you kind of have to bend things in a way that people are going to be able to hear it. So that, I think that's going to be the kind of tactic. But I think the response from the left, and I think we've seen this on abortion, is that when you're talking about immigration, I think we've been talking about these archetypal white liberals who live in this nice neighborhood and they don't want to live around diversity. I think on a visceral level, they kind of seize up. And by the way, everybody, again, there's no demographic in America which supports open borders. So everybody kind of gets queasy and is like, do I really want to have Venezuelan gangs? Do I really want to be around people who can't speak English? Do I really want, do I want to deal with people who don't have a driver's license driving around, and so on? So it's a very visceral thing that everybody feels. And with abortion, obviously there are principled Christians who believe that, fetuses have the right to life, and abortion is murder. And there are people who are ideologically motivated, religiously motivated. But that's not the majority of voters. Majority of voters are in this kind of self-interested way, thinking, okay, what affects me in my life? And for a majority of men, it's like, abortion, I don't really know. Maybe I have some feelings. But for women, it's like this: they can imagine being physically in the situation of being pregnant with somebody's baby that, could be a rapist, could be that extreme. Now, maybe that's less than 1% of cases. I don't know the statistics, but at least they can imagine that as a mythological symbol. And for education, I've seen conservatives try to drive this point home with voters that, that these teachers, they're corrupting the youth of our nation, and we really need to take back our schools and so on. But I think if that became the main central issue, the way that conservatives would need to make it in order to have effective policy change, I think the reaction from the left could be very successful in the same way that they've said, hey, my body, my choice. It would be, hey, leave these teachers alone, let them teach what they want to teach. And even though I think for a lot of Americans, the actual act of having an abortion is fairly low status and distasteful. I think actually most people, even if they had an abortion, they don't brag about that. And in the same way, I think Americans find the idea, shout, oh, America's a racist country. They kind of find that low status and distasteful. But do they have the attention span and the focus and the visceral connection to that issue in order to force change versus just the forces of inertia, which say, leave the teachers alone. I mean, the teachers' unions are still very powerful, one of the most powerful unions in America. So,
Yeah, but interestingly, that was the narrative in Virginia where, McAuliffe said, teachers know best what to teach in the classroom, and Youngkin was saying, no, parents, they should be the ones who decide. And ultimately, parents won over teachers in that calculus. And so I actually think the lesson there was that if you make this about the state versus the family, teachers representing the state, parents representing family, family and parents are going to win. And similarly, I think when it comes to imagery, in Scotland, one of the reasons that a major reason that the Scottish National Party leader was deposed was she was pushing this Gender Recognition Act, and a picture of a tattooed male prisoner going into women's prison hit the headline. So something visceral like that suddenly renders this policy absurd and mobilizes. And so I would suspect it'll be something like that, an image of a child's book talking about fellatio, or something that's very sort of salacious, as you say, will be pushed in media, will be the thing that sort of turns it, as well as a slogan like, parents should have the right to know, what's being taught. Something about parents' rights, something visceral like that will probably be the way this goes down. If I were to say, just in terms of the political communications. And I think that could be done also with, it could be that maybe you could also get away from teachers, because obviously if you could split off, activist teachers who are actually a relatively small minority, that they are pushing, they hate America, or they're teaching kids to hate America, or something like that, and maybe with some examples, that could also become, I think, part of this package. It would probably be a package. It probably would have to be packaged up under a handy label. But I think it could, in the future, become more important, if I were to say. But it remains to be seen how that's going to be done by which politician.
yeah, I guess I see a lot of these things as being symbolic. And so, for example, you could have a national ban on pornography in schools, that these libraries are not allowed to have any depictions of nudity whatsoever. Now, the sex educators might have a problem with that, but conceivably, let's suggest that something like that occurred. Well, the statistics on children viewing pornography is actually quite high outside of schools. So it's always been ironic to me, or I've always had to kind of scratch my head, maybe being from a younger generation, is like, do these parents, I mean, how many parents actually have content blockers on their children's internet access? What percent is it? Is it 33%? I mean, I don't have the data, but I think a lot of the parents who are, they're concerned about early childhood exposure to sexual themes, that they find it appropriate. And it's kind of a misdirected energy of, say, honestly, there is a library in my public school, and I never was pleasure reading or going, yeah, there's a lot of books in there. There's Moby Dick, there's the Bible, there's all sorts of graphic depictions of all sorts of things. And that might not be appropriate for children. The grim fairy tales might not be appropriate for children. But, the internet actually still is, in terms of pornography, this kind of Wild West. And in some senses, I mean, I guess call me woke, but I'd rather actually have, I've seen these depictions of sexuality in these quote unquote children's books. And, is it weird? Is it grooming? I mean, sure, you could call it that, but in comparison to the hardcore pornography that is Google search away, it's like this is kind of, you're kind of comparing a speck of sand to entire beach here, kind of thing. So I think I'm not sure what the actual effect of something like that would be on the gender and sexuality, as well as for the transgenderism things. I find that conservatives do have this idea that it is teachers who are leading the charge. It is teachers who are the single point of converting children to transgenderism, when I actually think it's social media that has a much bigger effect. And I actually think it's peer groups that have a much bigger effect. And so I'm not certain that conservatives are effectively going to be able to legislate away, even if they were as successful as you've kind of laid out as a possibility. I'm not sure that would have an effect. Now, race, maybe that's an area where they can have a greater effect. I mean, I certainly feel that my own views on race were significant. They didn't come from social media or my peer group, especially if you grow up in a majority white community. I mean, there's not a lot of diverse people around to kind of educate you on their lived experiences or something. You have to learn that from a K through 12 teacher. You have to learn that from the curriculum. So I actually think that the area where if conservatives want to turn back the clock on something, they actually probably could make they could probably be more effective on racial issues than some of these others.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting there. And I first of all want to agree with you that, I mean, the data that I've seen would suggest that schools are not having a big impact on either trans or LGB type identification. So, in fact, if you compare public schools with private, parochial, and homeschool, in the data that I've seen, there's very little difference in terms of heterosexual versus non-heterosexual, trans. Not, so I'm inclined to agree with you on that. However, on the political front, certainly in terms of partisanship, in terms of views on, say, white guilt, reparations, all these sorts of things, the data that I did this work with Zach Goldberg showed very clearly that exposure to more concepts is heavily correlated with belief in these things. As you say, maybe race is more susceptible to that. But I think in general, the schooling is having an impact on political attitudes. Very much so. I actually think universities are not having very much impact. The views are already pretty crystallized by the time they set foot on campus. So I think the battle is really around, political socialization in high school. But as far as the sexual stuff, you're right. The only thing I would say is that clearly the kind of moral charge that you're getting in the classroom is different than what you're getting on an illicit, not illicit, but the internet. People know they're doing something wrong, or at least that they're not allowed to do. I think that's got a different tenor to it. But I take your point that certainly in terms of the sexual identity, there's not a lot of evidence that school is really making much difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I've tried to look at data from Russia on this because certainly they've passed laws. I mean, that would be sort of the wet dream of certain conservatives to say, oh, we're just going to ban gay propaganda and so on. It's probably farther right than, I mean, it used to be Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee. That was normal in the Republican Party. Now that's become far right. But, Putin did it. And I'm actually not sure what the effect in terms of young people, if that's going to kind of reverse trends that were present in Russia, and what exactly is the data? How reliable is it out of Russia? I'm not sure. But that would be kind of my crystal ball into a future of a hyper-conservative America is, okay, you have control of the legislature. What are you able to accomplish? And I think we're in agreement here that the sexual revolution that happened in the 1960s was not the only sexual revolution in history. There were other sexual revolutions in the 1890s, for example, and we're now living through another one of those. And it's going to be very hard for government to legislate that, where government probably does have more leverage is in terms of racial attitudes, racial narratives. I think, from my perspective, I don't think I ever would have heard about Martin Luther King had it not been for public school. I don't think anyone in my family or my community or peer group would have said, "Oh, you got to learn about this guy. He's really a good guy. He's a high status guy. You gotta know about this guy." Now, are conservatives going to rip that up by the roots and say we're just not going to teach MLK anymore? We're just going to teach, Pilgrims, Mayflower, George Washington, founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. This is all good stuff. And, we're not, civil rights, it's the law and whatever. but we're really not even going to address it. We're not even going to touch that. Or are they basically going to say, no, MLK was a good Republican conservative, and we're going to still keep that part of civil rights. We're just not going to have all this woke stuff. So I guess what I think government actually could seriously change the narrative on race in America. My question is just, are the sort of reforms that are being proposed saying, you can't say America is a racist country. Well, if you teach MLK, and then people are aware of racial disparities, it's kind of hard not to come to the conclusion that America is a racist country on some level. I mean, it's difficult without some kind of Nathan Kaufman style boldness in that direction. So yeah, and I'm not sure how far conservatives are willing to go on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that on that, what really the conservatives would or should do is to try and get more of a world historical contextualization into all of these debate. So how does America's trajectory compare with other countries? Whether that be slavery, whether that be settler colonialism, whether that be, just to say, well, these were things that were being done all over the world. And here's, by the way, a vivid example. We're going to look at the Aztecs or the Comanche Empire and look at how they dealt with slavery, dealt with prisoners, etc. Just at the emotional level, people understand that there's not this singular goody baddie. So we shouldn't have 70% of under 25 Americans thinking that Native peoples lived in peace and harmony prior to the arrival of the European. That kind of just try to correct some of those misperceptions to try and get a more balanced. It doesn't change the facts of what was done in Jim Crow, but it's just putting them into a context which takes some of the emotional sting and some of the moral clarity out of a very simplistic kind of worldview that exists now. I think that would probably be the aim, not to hide facts of history or to gloss over shameful episodes, but this thing about talking, all countries are racist countries if what we mean is there are some racists in them and they have done racist things in the past, right? So what we're saying is really relative to other racist countries, where does this racist country sit? That kind of relativization is, I think, going to be needed to take away some of that kind of very stark moralizing, that kind of worldview that some people are coming out of school with. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna add to this, and I know if you're running out of time, let me know, and we'll stop here shortly. But I just wanted to say that from the perspective of the left, if you go to them and you say, well, the Aztecs did human sacrifice and the Mongols, did atrocities and so on, their response is going to be, yes, we don't deny those historical events happened, and if they were still happening today, we would oppose them as well. However, what's important is the fact that America is the richest country in the world, and there's still this inequality between blacks and whites, and that is a problem right here and right now. So they view a conservative bringing up historical context, which, when I was in K through 12, I was taught about the Aztecs. I was aware of the Mongols. That wasn't hidden from me. But the moral compulsion there was to say that we are trying to deal with real problems in the real world today. This is what's going on. We need to solve this. We need equality now. The civil rights movement was 60 years ago. We didn't achieve it then, and so we need to do something radical right here, right now, whether that's reparations, double affirmative action, whatever that is. Clearly what we're doing is not good enough, and so we need to double down on that. And so I don't know that conservatives writ large have an effective response, and I know that there's different strains of conservatism out there, and there's disagreements, and so I guess we'll see which one is popular, which one is effective, and which charismatic DeSantis leader comes to the fore, and which strategy they choose in the coming election cycles. But I know we've been doing this for quite some time. I appreciate your time today, and I do want to give you the last word and final remarks.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to say that, I guess, well, what you just said, I think is important, and that I think a lot of this is not so much about alternative facts as about taking the emotional sting away and applying. So children, I think, need to learn something visceral about whether it be the Comanches, whether it be about maybe sexism in the African American community, something that will take the romantic shine off so-called victim groups and will put the sort of dominant group in more of a world historical contextual framework so that they aren't seen as irreparably bad. So we have to have more on one of the so-called victim groups. We need to understand some of the atrocities they committed, some of the discrimination that happened, just to and also a balance piece. Something like, if we talk about the racial wealth gap, we have to. I mean, it could be that this is a legacy of generations of discrimination. Undoubtedly, that's part of it. But maybe what are some other alternative theories to do with, intact families, for example, to say that, blacks were making very good progress, at a time when they had intact families, low crime rates, all these other things. That the Thomas Sowell type argument. So what I would say is just a more balanced kind of approach, I think, would be the aim. But anyway, yeah, last comment I suppose also is just to check out my book, The Third Awakening, and also I've got a course on a 15-week course on woke at my university online, open to anybody, and my Twitter at EPKAUFM. So that's pretty much it from me.
All right, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you speaking with me. We covered a lot of ground, and I hope at some point in the future we get the opportunity to speak again.
Thanks, Jocko.